Oh, Justine's here. Hello,
Hi,
Justine.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine.
I'm good. So I kind of see this conversation as just like our normal Friday afternoon conversations, but with an intention, you know, in terms of we've got a subject to talk about.
Good, because I'm very unprepared. I was thinking, I started writing some notes and then I thought, oh, it's been so busy this week, I haven't had a chance. So, yeah, but if it's a conversation, then that's cool.
I don't know whether the people who booked will turn up, because a lot of them are members, but whatever. But maybe this would be a good way to explore the subject and take it further in other ways.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a really big subject. But I've never really spoken to people like Richard Toye about it, or there's another lady who's a classicist who's sort of been on the margins of the speechwriters. She's not a speechwriter, but she goes into schools and teaches them classic.
Yeah.
What's her name? Did you watch that presentation from that University of Chicago chap, Justine? You know, the one who says about, what's her name? Arlene Holmes Henderson. Yeah, she's a classicist. The chap from Chicago who talks about how academic writing is bad, and as they get older, you know, the more the real people that they set up a writing faculty in the University of Chicago. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Not for the undergraduates, not for the graduates, not for the PhD students, but for the academic staff, who are by far the worst writers of the lot. And he basically taught them that the difference is between academic writing is your writing, you know, as a student, you're paid, your tutor is paid to read your stuff. So they have to read it. And similarly, the PhD imaginators, things like that. But as soon as you start publishing, well, you have to write for an audience. So you have to structure it in a way that to make it people want to read it.
Yeah.
And that is a massive difference between all what they've been doing for the length of their university career. And the other sort of weird thing that I've come across is that if you want somebody to write good, visceral English, you'll get that from a plumber or somebody who left school at 16, that the more they've been in the education system, the worse, the longer their sentences will be, the more abstract it will be. Any comments on that? Anybody?
Richard?
Well, I mean, I suppose, you know, I think that you could look at it in different ways. So that you could say, well, what is the purpose of writing? And the purpose is to persuade your audience. And what do you want to persuade them of? What if you want them to if you want to persuade them to give you an academic job? Now, in that case, something which may in fact be, you know, completely incomprehensible to ordinary people might do the job of persuading them to give you the job. So, you know, to be cynical about it, you can't just look at a piece of prose and say, well, I don't understand what the hell this is about. It may be serving a different purpose from what you think it might be serving.
That's still the case now, Richard, because one of the things this morning, I was just having a look at some terrible stuff that I've written. I mean, there's an article here, I've forgotten I'd even written it, in the British Journal of Sociology. And I started reading it, and it's just unreadable. It's got loads and loads of quotations. It's got, you know, bibliographies, etc., etc. And I remember when I first wrote a book which I tried to escape from academia, I thought it was quite reasonable. It was just Our Master's Voices. And I thought, right, I'm not going to have any footnotes at all. I'm not going to have any bibliography, blah, 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 blah. And I did that, most of all. And I'm going to have pictures in it. One thing I didn't allow for was that the author has to pay for the pictures. And I was dead lucky that I'd met a chap who was in charge of the photo lab at ITN. And he said, if you want some pictures, come in and help yourself to whatever you like. So I got free photos. And actually, although it sold quite well, and it was turned into a TV program that changed my life, I actually think when I look at it now, it's crap until you get to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is quite good. And after that, it's quite good. But I was still writing this torturous academic prose. Terrible stuff. Anyway.
But I think Richard's right, though. It does depend on the purpose. And I think, for me, I come across a lot of academics or people writing for academics who think that the way that they're going to impress people is to use as many long words and
That's right.
incredibly long sentences as possible. But then you do get something like, say, The Conversation or op-eds for the newspaper, and you're writing for a different audience. And I mean, a lot of my work is translating academics, if you like. Getting them to speak in a way that is convincing to an audience that they're not used to speaking to.
But Richard, you went through the system. You became an academic, but then presumably some publisher came to you and said, "Can you write us a mainstream historical book on this?" And then did your agent sort of teach you to write, or did you have that?
No,
an unusual historian like Quentin Skinner that you kind of can write a good.
Yes, but you see, that's a very interesting example that you mentioned, Quentin Skinner, because you and I had quite a long conversation about him a couple of months ago, didn't we? And I taught an MA class where I used one of his articles, which I thought is sort of quite an easy one to understand. And the MA, at least one MA student, was utterly perplexed about what Quentin had meant in this article. And I kind of had to explain it. And so I guess, well, look, various things. First of all, you're quite right that there is a lot of sort of impenetrable nonsense out there. And then there's kind of like varieties of bad writing, if you like, because there's genuinely impenetrable nonsense which doesn't really mean anything. Then there are articles which are actually have got good, sort of sensible fundamental content, but which are expressed in a way which is, unnecessarily difficult to understand. Yeah. And then I think you can say that, again, depending on your audience, that there's sort of what you might call legitimately complex writing, where you know that you're talking to a bespoke audience of people who do kind of speak the same language, and you want to communicate with them, so you talk in this particular way, and then to outsiders it looks sort of difficult and unnecessarily complicated. Well, if they want to switch audience and talk to a wider audience, then they will have to change the way that they talk. But you can't just point at that and say, well, it's incomprehensible, but therefore it's bad writing.
I know, but I see a really, really big problem in the sense that we have scientists who say we understand science, okay, and we have evidence and we can prove that this is true. But with any observation or any insight, a speechwriter has to say, or a politician has to say, which means that, and with the question of the graphs that they put up at these press conferences about COVID and things like that.
Yeah.
And they can say, well, here's the graph.
No.
and like, I have to accept it because I'm not an expert, and here's the graph. Whereas that's not a democratic society. That's not
I think various people were saying on Twitter, but Martin Shovel maybe was one of them. Sort of like their PowerPoint presentations are terrible. But that is a case where they are doing something that is public facing, which is different from if they were writing it in a journal. So the fact that you or I might look at an article on astrophysics and not have the faintest idea what it's talking about, that doesn't have to be a problem necessarily. It's a problem if somebody tries to write a popular book about astrophysics and can't translate what the technical language into stuff that's easily incomprehensible. Or it's also a problem if an asteroid is heading for the planet Earth and the astrophysicist needs to stand up and explain what's going on, and they can't do it in front of an audience, and they put up bad PowerPoint slides. So all I'm saying is that I think first of all, one needs to sort of maybe be a bit cautious about the cliche that academics are kind of bad writers. But then secondly, I would say there's what might constitute bad writing constitutes a wide variety of different things, because I would cite, for example, I've just had to referee a manuscript by a very distinguished scholar for a major academic publisher, and all the sentences are perfectly clear, but having read 700 pages of this stuff, is he really arguing? That's a different question. You can't fault him on his writing exactly, but you can fault him on his argumentation.
But also,
the thing is, sorry, it's very interesting, this one, because when I was fellow at an Oxford college, Desmond Morris was a fellow of the same college, and in fact, he even wrote a blurb on, I always say it's top readers recommend it, on the back of our Master's Voices. And I remember Desmond saying, once you've written a popular book, you'll be finished academically. Yeah. And I said, what? And because one of the things he did, he said, why don't you go and see Tom Mashler at Jonathan Cape, who had published Desmond's book, The Naked Ape. So I went to see Mashler, and I'd sent him a copy of the manuscript. And I said, what do you think of it? And he said, I think you need a co-author. I said, do you mean a ghostwriter? He said, well, you could call it that. I said, well, it's very odd you should say that, because the stuff I write in sociology is controversial as far as sociologists are concerned. But one pleasant thing that people say about it is that even if they disagree with the article, I can write. And Mashler said, that just speaks to the appalling standard of writing in the academic world. And I said, but Desmond Morris is an academic. He said, it took me 2 years to get him to write The Naked Ape. And I said, well, why did you do that? He said, as soon as he told me the title, I knew there was a bestseller. And he said, I used to take him out for lunch, a seriously good business lunch, about every 2 or 3 months. And I only said one thing to him. And I said, what was that? He said, Desmond, you write this book and I'll make you a millionaire. And he did. Because at the time I met Mashler, Desmond's Naked Ape has sold 15 million copies. I mean, but he got away with it, except he didn't academically, because I think the ethologists took no notice of him from then onwards, because he started writing very popular books. And I'm not saying that happened to me, but because I did write a few quite popular books, and I now have the dilemma, it's an interesting dilemma, that the publishers are quite interested in the idea of a new edition of Lend Me Your Ears. And I've been reading through it and I think, oh God, what can I change? There's a hell of a lot I can change. Because the person who actually taught me to write for readers was my agent. I never had an agent when I wrote this. An agent contacted me and he said, when you write your next book, contact me. And so 20 years later, I wrote to him and I said, I think I've got a new book in mind. He said, what's that? I said, it's called Lend Me Your Ears. It wasn't, it was called something else. I wanted to call it The Joy of Speaking. Because in those days, the joy of sex was a big seller. I think now it wouldn't work because even the joy of sex, people have forgotten. But I do have an interesting dilemma, which is how do I go about revising and re-editing and reworking a book that has sold quite well. It hasn't made me millions like The Naked Ape, but I'm quite keen that it should be republished.
Okay. Okay. Well, what I'll do, I'll wait a couple of more minutes, and then I'll just do a little introduction. But Richard, do you feel that when you're submitting an article for publication in a journal, or if you're writing for you know, for a popular history book, do you consciously change your style?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think there's a change in you know, the structure perhaps, and the which I don't know. I would say there's a change in how far you foreground the secondary literature, so that in a journal article you're going to need a section which, you know, explicitly discusses what previous people have said on this topic, whereas and sort of name check them, whereas in a popular book I might name check, you know, depending on the book. Sometimes I name check other historians, sometimes I don't. And, you know, I obviously put in references, but the question is, do you say, you know, Paul Addison said this, Martin Gilbert said that, or do you just say, well, there are two schools of thought on this, you know? So in the more popular writing, I would allow the sort of historiography or the scholarship to sort of fade, to inform it, but to sort of fade into the background. Whereas in an academic article, you're going to, you know, kind of have that front and center, if you like, because that is kind of what you're trying to, you know, you're trying to prove to the reader, in a sense, that you're making a breakthrough in the scholarship, whereas the ordinary general reader may not actually be particularly bothered about that.
And have you done much lecturing? Do you feel that if you're a good lecturer, does that help you get promotion, or is good lecturing, you know, because I remember at university, some lecturers used to be packed out, you know, and others, you know, that have sort of 25 for the first one, and then by the fourth one, there were like 3 people left at the front, you know. In university, is there, you know, being a good lecturer, is that part of the...
Yeah, I'd say it's fairly essential. I mean, to be a good teacher in general. I mean, I think there was a time when, you know, people, I mean, when I was at university, there were some great lecturers, and there were some who were just really abysmal. And I think that in general, the standard has probably, you know, heightened significantly. You know, that there's much less kind of, you know, dead wood. People can't get away with it. But I suppose, you know, I think the assumption now is pretty much just expected you'll be a good lecturer. And when you're making job appointments, you're trying to, you know, sort of find the person who might be, you know, revolutionizing the field, I suppose. So, you know, sort of good teaching almost kind of taken for granted as a necessary skill these days. Okay.
Well, I'll say a few opening words, and then I'll start with who's going to start? Justine, do you want to say a few words to start?
Happy to.
Okay. Well, I'll just do an introduction. You know, my research over the last year has, you know, looking at rhetoric and the trivium and things like that, has made me realize that in the Renaissance, the absolutely most important thing was to turn out versatile writers and speakers. You know, it was almost entirely linguistic. You did Latin for 4 or 5 years, and then you learned to speak and to express yourself as richly and as poetically and as eloquently as you could, because that was the skill that you needed to lead society and create a democracy of differing points of view. But modern education assumes that you can write. I don't think there's any, you know, I did a few kind of creative writing exercises at school, but I think that sort of, you know, the University of East Anglia has creative writing courses, and that's all airy-fairy, like, you know, nobody's going to employ you doing that sort of stuff. So there's very, very little focus on becoming a good writer. And one of the things I was saying a bit earlier is that we now have science, which is hugely influential, hugely powerful. And it seems to me with scientists, you prove something, and you do experiments, and you come away and you announce that you've proved this thing, but they don't usually do, which I think is a real problem in a democracy. Just because you proved something doesn't actually mean that certain consequences follow. The fact that something might, like butter might be unhealthy doesn't mean to say that, which means that you shouldn't eat butter. That there is a sort of, all truth has to be interpreted and applied in different degrees of proportion. So I was saying earlier that these press conferences where they talk about the coronavirus and they'll talk about this is a factor and these are the symptoms and the number of people suffering and things like that, and therefore, which means that we have a lockdown. Whereas, and when you try and argue with them, they say, well, they're experts, they know, we don't know, we're just sort of troublemakers, artists, whatever, whatever, lockdown skeptics or whatever it is. But that seems to me anti-democratic, that if science is just self-evident and it doesn't need to be proved, that's highly problematic. It doesn't need to be explained and it doesn't need to be used persuasion. I also remember at university that basically, when I was writing an arts essay, I would go to the library and I would copy out, well, I'd basically read all the books that were mentioned on the reading list and copy a bit out of there, copy a bit out of there, and then I would just rephrase it. And I remember Ursula von der Leyen got in trouble that somebody found her PhD thesis and sort of Googled some of it and realized an awful lot of it was plagiarized. Now, I would say in my generation, huge amounts of stuff, if you were to get our old essays out, it was all plagiarized, And this idea that and I think that if you want to game the university system, if I was telling my kids, I'd say go to the lectures, copy down the lecture notes and regurgitate them as effectively as possible in the exams and you will do extremely well. This idea that you are kind of being cultivated as a, I think we do learn to think, but I think that getting a good degree at university is not necessarily, if you've got good parents who can tell you what to do, you can game the system. That's my, I've not been near a university for 30 years. We've got a few university academics here, people involved with university. I'm just curious to have a conversation about these things for the next 50 minutes. And we've got Richard, we've got Justine, we've got Max with all our experience. So Justine, am I being fair? Is this your experience?
Yeah. Well, I was going to start off with something that you said there about writing and that we aren't taught to write anymore. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I see a lot of people who think they can write, and I do have to spend a lot of time editing or rewriting their work. And I'm talking fairly short pieces quite often. But I think there's one thing that improves your writing no end, and that's just practice. And I was very lucky as a small child. I lived in New Zealand, and the school I went to, every morning, the first thing you did was write a story from the age of 4 up. And I think that kind of set me up with a love of writing for life. But then I ended up working as an editor. And I think the more you edit and look at other people's work, and the more you learn to cut words, refine, and so on, the better. And I started off editing legal journals because I have a law background. And I think just before we started, we were talking and talking about the different purposes for which you write. And I think academics write like everyone else does for a number of different purposes. But I do think that no matter who you're writing for, clarity and actually understanding for yourself what you're trying to say is one of the really important things that I think gets lost. I think if your purpose is to impress someone else, then you still need to be clear about it. And starting out as a legal editor was probably a fantastic way to learn to improve people's writing, because as everybody knows, lawyers tend to write in legalese. I mean, half the time they can't even understand what they're each saying in their letters to each other. So, you know, you kind of starting off by trying to edit complex academic writing for lawyers was kind of a good way to go with that. But I'm one of these people who does have, on top of my law degree and my arts degree, I do actually have one of these masters in creative writing as well. So for all its airy-fairiness. But that actually taught me a lot too. Anyway, I think I've waffled completely on from, I'm not quite sure what the question was.
What was your creative writing? You know, I think that you can, you know, I went to journalism school, and I think we did learn an awful lot about writing for audiences, structuring news reports and things like that. And as you say, you know, the more you do it, the more you get good at it. It's something you have to do to practice.
Yeah, and I think editing other people teaches you to edit your own work too. And I think that one of the best exercises you can do is to take a long piece and make it a short piece, and do that constantly. And I think, I mean, in my work now, I work for Cambridge University. I work as a speechwriter, but I also work on a lot of events that we hold. And for these events, these seminar events, I interview our academics. I'll write marketing pieces based on kind of what they've told me and articles about them. But I'm also trying to, when we actually hold the webinar, to get them to express themselves clearly in a way that the audience is going to understand. So, I mean, and I think, I mean, there was one recently, I mean, when I say me, I'm getting the academic who's hosting the webinar to do that. I suppose I'm doing the research for somebody else, but there was one recently where I got each of the people involved to express their thesis in 2 sentences, because I knew that otherwise, for a lay audience, because I knew that otherwise, if we got them doing a presentation on their thesis, we're lost straight away. And if you can't express yourself quickly and clearly and don't understand what your own PhD is about, then you're in trouble. And I think a lot of the universities now run these 3-minute thesis competitions where students do have to express their thesis in 3 minutes. And I think it's a really, really good exercise to try and, whatever you're writing about, how quickly and clearly can I actually express this? I was proofreading a document yesterday, which I would have just loved to slash to pieces, but it had reached proofing point, where someone managed to write an entire page on the purpose of a library by repeating over and over again ridiculous sentences about how this was going to be a wonderful place to contemplate studies for everyone. I can pull it up and read some of it out loud. I mean, but it's over and over for an entire page, this description of what this library is going to be like. And I was like, seriously? I think a library is fairly self-explanatory. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but you know, and it's just boring.
But you said last week you wrote something for Bill Gates. Did you think that what Bill Gates was saying was concrete, and or was he just talking some corporate nonsense that you kind of collaborated with him to create, and he sort of mouthed, and because he's got so much power and status, nobody dares say, actually, do you know what you're really talking about? Are you really talking about sense?
Well, I don't know if he's recorded it, but I wrote him a really personal piece. Okay. So I wrote him, I mean, it was only 2 minutes, but it was based on what I've read of him saying about his father and what an influence his father was in his life. So I don't know whether he will give that speech as I wrote it, but I haven't heard that it's been rejected. So I assume he's going to record it and give it, but I don't know. Like,
what's interesting about Bill Gates is that although Microsoft is largely responsible for bloody PowerPoint, when he did a TED talk, he didn't use PowerPoint at all. He did a talk on mosquitoes, and he pretended that he'd got a bunch of mosquitoes in a jar, and he wafted them around the lecture theatre. And so he had some quip like, "I don't see why just poor people should get malaria." And I mean, I thought it was quite good. And I was sitting there thinking, but Microsoft invented bloody PowerPoint. And PowerPoint is still the death of most presentations.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, well, thank you, Justine, for those observations. Richard, does PowerPoint feature very much in academia where you work in history?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's essential. I mean, I suppose that Max is right that PowerPoint can and often is used in a very ineffective way. But, you know, I think the reason why it's still the industry leader, in spite of the fact that there are other things like Prezi, which people can use, is that it's quite simple and intuitive to actually use. And I guess what I always tell the students is that to have an effective presentation, you don't just want a bunch of bullet points, that you can use it to, the use of images is very critical.
Yeah.
And that I say, you know, my sort of slogan is that it should be illustrations, not wallpaper. And therefore you're using you're talking about the image is in order to advance your argument, not simply to say, well, you know, my discussion is a presentation on rocks, so here is a rock sitting in the background while I talk, you know. But I suppose I thought that Robert actually made a good point in the chat about lawyers and sort of the purposes of them writing as they do. I think it's really about you know, it's difficult to label one thing or another as necessarily being bad writing. It's really about whether or not it persuades a particular audience and achieves its purpose. And so I think that, you know, I was sort of almost trying to devise a kind of taxonomy of different types of bad writing, which, you know, range from typos and grammatical errors, which are very frustrating, and you even do come across them when people submit their PhDs. You know, you can come up with long lists of you know, minor errors which really kind of destroy your kind of reading experience. And then there is, and I mean, I grant there is an element of people using kind of unnecessarily long words and sort of terms of art which don't really mean very much. Excessively long sentences and excessively long paragraphs are often things which could easily be sorted out, but people just sort of, you know, get too enthusiastic and sort of write longer and longer sentences. But then I think there's a sort of a problem about, you know, sort of argumentation is the broader problem. And I think that with student writing, where actually most students at, you know, at Exeter University anyway, you know, they're not terrible writers, but what their problem is they don't know what their best argument is. You know, they've written 2,000 words, and there's a good idea. There may be more than one good idea in there, but they haven't identified what actually is the key point, what the strongest point that they have available to make. And they need to make that kind of front and center and explain it at the beginning and develop it throughout. And very often it kind of crops up, you know, a third of the way through or 2/3 of the way through. And you think, oh, that's interesting. That's what you're trying to say. Why didn't you tell me that before? You know? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the cure, I mean, Justine is right about practice, but it's also editing. And, you know, really people have, you know, two things here. We give students a hell of a lot of feedback, but they don't necessarily always take it on board, because they kind of look at the mark and go, all right, 68, I'm happy with that, you know, or, you know, oh, I got a 58, well, I'm just not going to look at this any longer. And so they don't actually necessarily look through and carefully implement all the very careful feedback which we've actually given them. And so but it's also about taking the time, and, you know, the students need to, anybody of course needs to plan their time in such a way that they don't just finish the thing, they don't just finish their, however many words it is, and bung it in, 5 minutes before the deadline. They need to allow themselves sufficient time to edit, rethink, work out what their strongest and best argument is, and to put that across in the most effective way possible.
Yeah, and to plan as well, to plan and structure what it is that they're going to write.
But then why in university don't they spend the first week when you're a student of saying there's this thing called inventio, arrangement, style, elocutio, memoria, and pronunciatio, whereby you inventio is you create all your arguments, you put them all down, and then arrangement is that you arrange them in the order of the strongest first, and then style is that you kind of give them the style that they need, putting in some rhetorical techniques. It seems to me a basic sort of introduction into how to write your essay, and the idea that you might have to rewrite it and look for your best argument. If you knew that in your first week at university, you might think, well, maybe it's the wrong thing to just be in the library, copying it down, trying to write 4 sides so it covers everything. You know what I mean?
Brian, the first week of university is the worst time to tell anybody anything. Because this is a problem. You've got to understand student psychology, which is that in week 1, they are being bombarded with huge amounts of information where, we're trying to make sure, amongst other things, that they don't, become depressed and commit suicide, right? We need to have, or people think in order to achieve that, we need to have slides in week 1 saying, here is where to go if you experience a mental health crisis. Yeah. Now, the fact is that people, it's all very well meant, but they're so bombarded with information, and this is a kind of sort of a rhetorical problem, or it's kind of a persuasive problem, that well, I'm not having a mental health crisis at the minute, so I don't really need to pay attention now. I can look at my phone, and so they may have they may well have a mental health crisis 3 weeks later, and they haven't absorbed the information. So of course, you're quite right that these are things that need to be taught, but you sort of almost have to appreciate the huge number of things which we're trying to do kind of simultaneously, and very much students, to try and get students' attention. I'm not saying this is incompatible with what you're saying, but I'm just making it as an observation, that unless they can sort of immediately see the payback in terms of getting more marks, then it's difficult to get them to pay attention to kind of things which might be very helpful, yet which might seem quite abstract.
Surely by the time they get to university, they should be able to write an essay in any event.
As I say, they've
had 12 years of school.
they're not in general terrible, we on the whole, most people come out with a 2-1 or a first, and they do so on the basis of writing reasonably sensible stuff. Some of them are writing very good stuff. We should emphasize that some of them really are good. Others kind of are at this slightly indifferent level where they're not maximizing what they could do for various reasons, including the fact that they may not be sufficiently motivated to, as I say, there are plenty of people who sort of get a high 2-1 and that's all right, or a mid 2-1 or a low 2-1, and that's all right as far as they're concerned. So to try and get them to think, well, how could I really make this the best thing that it could possibly be? That's what we're continually trying to inspire them to do. But obviously, we don't succeed in all cases.
Okay, Max, thank you, Richard. Max, would you like to make some comments?
Sorry?
Would you like to make some comments, Max?
Well, I think I've probably spoken enough. All I would say, going back to the chap who taught me to write, it was my agent. And one of the things that I've done ever since he got his hands on me is to stop using, when I'm writing, the full forms. So instead of writing would not, I write wouldn't. Instead of writing did not, didn't, wouldn't, didn't, couldn't, hadn't. And when I first tried it, he told me, he said, I think you should I think you should think of the audience more. And this is the same with public speaking, and it's the same with writing for readers. You have to think of the audience. And he said, why don't you write more like you speak? And what my reply was to say, but in academia, we would never write wouldn't, didn't, couldn't, hadn't. He said, well, just try it and see if it works. And I went through the entire manuscript. Everywhere I'd used the full form, I changed it to the diminutive form. And I read through it again. I thought, bloody hell, it does make it a lot more readable. So that's my top tip of the day.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't agree with you on that one. I can't stand it.
You agree or not?
I don't agree. I really find that kind of really casual way of writing really irritating.
So, Alan, can I ask you? You teach politics at the University of East Anglia. You're looking to introduce a degree on rhetoric. What do you think of what we're saying?
Well, I was going to respond I'm going to pick up in part something Richard said, because I think he hit the sort of nail on the head when he said sometimes the students can write, but they don't know how to argue, what their argument is. And I think that's actually got your point about Renaissance, Brian, which is the problem is the separation of writing from argument. And what I found certainly when my kids were at school was they were being taught writing as a kind of abstract thing, fronted adverbials and all these kinds of formal devices. And it seems to me you can't teach writing. You can teach writing a letter, writing a descriptive essay, writing an argumentative essay, writing an adventure story, writing a... It's hard. You need to keep the teaching of the writing to the goal. And that's where you begin to bring in, as you say, rhetoric, inventio, and so forth. Is there something?
Hang on, we're getting some interference here. I don't know where it's coming from.
It was Claudio's, because we could see the lights of his, he put it off now.
All right, okay, I'll put it off. Okay, right, carry on, Alan. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I'm just talking about that connection between what you've got in the Renaissance is that the learning of writing is absolutely bound up with learning persuasive forms of communication, different kinds of styles. So I think that's part of what's happened is we pulled it away from that, and we're trying to teach writing as if it was some kind of activity distinct from writing particular sorts of things to achieve particular sorts of outcomes. So the students don't then know how to write the argument and don't really think of the writing and the art formulation of the argument, this is my experience anyway, as being the same moment. The sort of writing up of their thoughts is entirely kind of the last thing you do, having kind of thought about and done your notes and whatever it is. So so they don't really, when I talk to them, they don't really rewrite. They don't use the writing as a way of working out what they think. And they don't really see the essay as being about making an argument. And some of them will tell me that they've been taught that in school. They've been told in school that they should not really advance too much of their opinion. I don't know if Richard has the same thing. A very common question I get from students is it wrong to say I in the essay? Because they've been told not to say I. And I tell them, well, if it's appropriate, if it's you saying it, I think, then say I. But don't hide it. But they've been given the view they shouldn't be putting across their opinion or making because opinions are bad. They should just be stating the facts in these certain kinds of sentences. So the whole thing kind of falls apart from my point of view, where we want them to be making an argument, their argument, justified, sourced, explained, not simply stated and asserted. But all those kinds of things they find extremely difficult. But we don't, when you say, why don't we teach it? We don't teach it properly because it's extraordinarily labor intensive to do so. That teaching writing, I do have, in the US, rhetoric departments are usually also composition departments, and they partly survive by teaching writing to everybody else's students, but it's really, really hard work. You need to have lots of people who know how to write, and there's not many of those around in universities, who can then take the time to read through students' essays and make really careful comments and talk to them through it and explain it. And that the volume of kind of people hours there is just too high for any modern university in this country. Hope
Richard, did you want to come back on any of that?
Yes, well, I was just sort of to respond to what Alan said about the way in which they're taught in school. You know, that they, at least in history, GCSE and to some extent A-level, they're taught a kind of a weird idea of balance, that you're supposed to have a balanced argument. And I've literally seen somebody put it on Twitter, a thing from a GCSE textbook about Stalin, and sort of points in favor of Stalin and points against Stalin. On the one hand, he had a lot of people killed, literally. On the other hand, he didn't order them all killed personally himself. So, and then I kind of have a whole thing which I say to the students about they become very confused because they've been told that they need to have a balanced argument, right? And they've also been told that they need to have a strong argument. And then they think, well, how do I reconcile these two things? And of course, the answer is perfectly straightforward, is that your balanced argument is not by saying, well, lots of people think Hitler was bad, and lots of people think Hitler was good, or thought that he was good during his lifetime, so he was probably okay. Right, that's not a balanced argument. It is to try and take into account, to deal with all the contrary arguments, and so you're balanced by reflecting or understanding the views on each side, even if you rebut the other views, or and that's how you make your argument both balanced and strong at the same time. So you sort of it's labor intensive. Partly because, as Alan says, partly because you're sort of trying to undo the kind of brainwashing, weird brainwashing that they've had at school.
Okay. Arlene, are you able to make any comments on this? Is it a classics? Somebody's trying to bring back the classics?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of weird brainwashing going on in school at the moment. I put in the chat, Da Forest and A Forest. Has anyone heard of these?
No.
They're all the rage in English teaching classrooms at the moment. So when English teachers are teaching persuasive writing, or they're preparing students to write speeches that they're then going to deliver, this is the formula that all students must follow. So D stands for direct address. What do you think A stands for?
Alliteration.
Yeah, well done. You get the gold star. It's alliteration. Everyone must then have alliteration. No choice. It can't be an aphorism. No. It must be alliteration. F. Facts. Next come facts. That's what comes after alliteration. Everyone then must have facts. After facts, it's O.
It's going to be a long game.
So this is where English teachers vary. I've heard both opinions, but also onomatopoeia. I know onomatopoeia is undoubtedly more entertaining. I judge a lot of speech writing competitions, and the ones who have done onomatopoeia are infinitely funnier at this point than the ones that go for opinions. R is
rhythm.
Could be. I actually forget what R is.
Repetition.
I forget. E is definitely emotion. So this is where they have to think about emotion. They use emotive language is what they learn for E. S is statistics. So they have to, no matter what the topic that they are writing for their persuasive writing, they have to, and I often in a very contrived way, find statistics and put them in. And then finally T. It always ends with a rule of 3. So as someone who judges a speech writing competition at least once a month, it is so boring. Because had they, in my view, learned the classical rhetorical method, they would have so many more tricks and tools in their, I guess, in their equipment box from which to choose, rather than this very diluted version where, you know, I think it is in so many ways contrived and not doing them any justice. And I think it absolutely is possible to teach the classical rhetorical method and to do it well. I have worked in partnership with a number of English teachers through English subject associations. Some of them are education celebrities. So I don't know if we have any people who are familiar with English teachers on the call, but Matt Pinkett and Kat Howard have been teaching rhetoric in their classrooms really successfully. They've had national press coverage about this. Slovenia has reintroduced rhetoric onto its mainstream curriculum in primary schools using my research. So, you know, it absolutely can be done, and I think should be done.
But the thing is that now parents want kids that get to the top, you know, certainly in the private sector. They want their kids to get really good jobs and to get to the top. And I think that the evidence is that we're being governed by two people, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, who are both journalists who write opinion pieces for many years, you know, which is fantastic practice at communication. And you could, you know, somebody was saying yesterday, or was it 2 days ago, that oven ready deal was a brilliant bit of linguistic manipulation. You know, they can coin these 3-part lists, these things like that get them huge amounts of power and huge amounts of influence. But what strikes me about a lot of education is that it's obvious that these skills give people in their hands, they can become incredibly influential and powerful, but nobody wants to go near it. They don't want to touch it. There's some kind of like, no. You know, when I was in an oracy conversation, I started talking about this and about Quentin Skinner and the rhetoric and the Renaissance, and how Thomas Hobbes sort of said, well, actually, you know, we really want dictatorship. We don't want all these public school boys causing all this havoc by arguing all the time. And they just think I'm mad. Do you know what I mean?
I think the tide is turning on this, though. So the oracy APPG is launching its final report on the 28th of April. I'll put a link to the chat. You're all invited. And I am reading the final. I'm kind of helping them write the final report just now. I'm reading a draft at the moment. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that was submitted to their Speak for Change inquiry from schools across the country, including in very socioeconomically deprived areas, which shows that this is something that should be much higher up the educational agenda than it is.
Okay, well, I basically think from running the European Speechwriter Network that speechwriters are people who've been highly educated as a rule, but they've had to sort of unlearn a lot of the stuff that they learned at university and learn to write again, you know, for people in positions of power. And I would like to try and get schools to, you know, I think it's good for speechwriters to talk about what they do in front of young people because it can be inspirational and because it's practical. You know, I think if you want to go into politics and you were to draft a letter saying, you know, I'm Brian, I've just come out of university and I'm particularly interested in speechwriting and I'd really like to get some work experience with, you know, an MP. I think if you wrote a letter like that, it would get attention. Whereas most people say, well, I'm a conservative and I want to be in politics. They don't actually have any, you know, there's nothing, no sort of skill they're bringing to it, no kind of specialist knowledge necessarily. So how do we build a network where, you know, people like Jessica, I can say, Jessica, go and talk in Haberdasher's School or go and talk to this comprehensive school about your work as a speechwriter and what you've learned. And the school would listen to Jessica and think, well, that was a really good talk, because obviously Jessica's written hundreds of speeches, so she knows how to give a good talk. Whereas I think that at the moment they'd say speechwriters, that sounds like a rather dodgy thing to be doing. We wouldn't want to.
I'm not sure. I agree with what Arlen said. I mean, I think it's how you pitch it to schools as ever. I think if you're talking about sort of character building, or you're talking about sort of careers and you're talking really widely as speech writing, as good writing, something that, yes, you can become a speech writer, but you actually, these are skills that will be useful for every single job almost, then I think that schools would want to listen. I think if it's pitched in a really narrow way as sort of, you know, yes, there might be an assumption that it's a bit of a public school boys then they won't touch it with a barge pole. But I don't think that I don't think it has to be.
Probably got to call it effective communication rather than speech writing.
Yeah.
There are other ways of describing.
But is that something that interests schools, Arlene? Is it something that the headmaster will say, oh yes, that's interesting. We'll have to sort of invite somebody down from London. We'll pay their train fare and we'll pay them a £100 honorarium. Is that going to? It certainly won't work in the state sector, will it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two things. One is this Orsay APPG report is going to get a huge amount of media coverage. There's going to be like a lot of media splash. On the 28th of April, Emma Hardy MP is the chair of that APPG. She's going to be doing a lot of interviews that day. Press releases are going to be going out, flying out here, there and everywhere. Oxford Press Office is going to be pushing me out doing interviews. So I think that is going to be a great day. If any of you are doing anything speech writing related or Orsay related or communication related, that is going to be a really good day to promote it. And everything that is in that report is state school focused. And there are loads of examples throughout the report from state schools saying that they have prioritised speaking and listening skills and attainment has improved as a result. And that is what school leaders are interested in. That is what is going to be compelling for them. Right. The other thing is I've put a link in the chat to an organisation called Speakers for Schools. And that's a charity which sends speakers who have cool jobs like speech writing, and they take care of the financial side of things and they do the matching. So if you are a speechwriter and you want to inspire young people to be speechwriters or just to learn a bit more about your profession, Speakers for Schools can match you with schools.
I suppose I had some dealings with Emma Hardy, and what struck me about it when I was talking about the sort of aspiration for the elite, I'll read the story of Richard Burton, the great actor Richard Burton, and he had a teacher who who took this young man and said, right, you're going to get to the top, of acting and had a vision for him to get to the very top. What strikes me is about the state school teachers is they don't, it's just about giving them a basic skill set. It's not about saying, well, look, we've got a problem here. We've got a nation that is dominated by one school, If the state school are going to fight back, and you've got to nurture individuals and inspire them that they've got to get to the very top. You know what I mean? Things like Winchester, Rishi Sunak just assumes that he's going to become the next prime minister because at Winchester, that's what they expect you to sort of be doing, And it's impossible to deal with people like Rishi Sunak because the arrogance and the self-confidence is just like. What do you think, Alan, how you want to do a rhetoric course that isn't this what you've got to do? You've got to sort of have teachers who want their kids to get to the very top. And that's why the private schools win every time.
Yeah.
I think for us, it's because I would present it in terms of citizenship, you see, in terms of politics. So not sort of, after dinner kind of jolly, that sort of speech, which is great, but I mean, I don't pitch it as that. For us, it's citizenship. It's how to. So I do sometimes get asked to do talks at local schools in terms of because again, we bundle it up with how we teach politics. We say, well, okay, you've got to learn how politics works and what's right, but then you want to do politics. So here are things you can learn to do politics, and part of that is how to speak and communicate your arguments. It becomes part of citizenship. And that's why I do find there is interest in that, particularly once you've done it, because of course, once you've done it, people are like, oh, I can do this. There are techniques. So in that respect, that's the sort of hill to climb. I don't know if Arlene finds this too. It's getting people to see, no, public speaking is not a natural gift that some people are born with. It is a thing you can teach, a rather old argument, of course, but you can teach people to do this. And here is how you do it. But again, to go back to what we were saying earlier, linking it to what do you want to say? What's the argument? I thought it was interesting that De Forest never had anything like, well, what do you actually want to say? What do you believe? And that's where we start when we teach it to politics students is, well, what is the thing you think? Or more specifically, what is the thing you want other people to think at the end of your having spoken to them? What's the point? The principle, the proposition, the value, and that's what I think often really does kind of surprise students. They're like, oh, I have to have a thing to say first.
And not just students, I think lots of people. I mean, it's Because I don't think that isn't just in speeches, that's in all kinds of things that I come across. I think, you know, whole sentences of waffle, but not just whole sentences, whole pages. I mean, what are you actually trying to tell me here? And it's because the person who is writing it hasn't thought out what they want to say. They haven't worked out what their point is. They know they have to write something for some reason, but they haven't articulated it to themselves. And if they can't do that, they can't articulate it to anyone else.
Can I just chip in here with a fairly ancient story? When I was at Essex University in the, I forget, early 70s or late 60s, there was a debate, and I can't remember exactly who was there. Harold Wilson, there was a minister in Harold Wilson's government, and on the other side, the star speaker was a very distinguished professor of economics called Richard G. Lipsey. And he was such a successful economist that he'd sold so many textbooks that he was thinking of buying a private airplane. That's how bloody good he was. Anyway, he was Canadian. And so we were expecting him to, you know, do the sort of line that he'd taken. And he stood up and he said, well, the only thing that's going to make life change in this country is to abolish the public schools. And this was Essex, which was a pretty radical university in those days. And there was a gasp. Lipsey, a brilliant economist, saying, we've got to abolish the public schools. And his argument was absolutely brilliant. But the trouble is, I'm so old, I can't remember what he said. But it was absolutely fantastic. I thought, well, that's a bit extreme. I went to a public school, crap though it was, and it, you know, it didn't get easy access to Oxbridge and Cambridge and all that sort of stuff. That's largely because it was in the north of England. But anyway, the point is that there has to be something done about the so-called public schools, because so long as they survive, we're going to have to put up with endless people. I did a little survey quite recently. If you look at number of prime ministers since the war in the UK, something like 70 or 80% of them went to Oxford or Cambridge. None of them went to any other red brick. The only prime minister who went to a red brick university was Gordon Brown. And the other one who didn't go to any university was Jim Callaghan.
And John Major.
Apart from that, they're all Oxbridge graduates, public school, Oxbridge, into number 10. And I just think it's time this was changed.
Florian, what's it like in Germany? What are your views on what's your perspective?
On schools, you mean?
Well, you're a rhetoric. You've taught rhetoric, haven't you?
Yes, I was teaching history, as Richard did, and I was teaching 15 years ago. I left the university, but what I think was quite good good exercise for my students was that I said, I don't want anything great of you, but a small article, only 3 pages, 60 signs a line. 30 lines, so very defined, and I want only a short piece of you and write on this subject, this or that subject. And the trick was I wanted to avoid them to copy from other articles, to make it very short. And they were very happy to hear that they have to write only 3 pages. But after a week, they came to me and they said, it's an awful lot of work to write a short article. And, yes, because they noticed they had to get it short, and to even the short form is a lot of work. And I think that was the result. They learned that, and that was very important for me to make them clear, to write what's writing about.
Okay.
So you have to think first, and I always told them, you are studying the humanities, and we have to be the experts in writing and speaking. And I think that's an important message for the students to have.
Okay. But sort of obscure German academics is something. It still exists, doesn't it?
Yes, in fact.
Okay. Robert, do you have any views on this?
One thing, I mean, hasn't been said yet. I mean, some good points being made about, you know, what you learn from editing other people's work and summarizing and things like that. One thing I think that causes bad writing is people don't read enough these days. Because I think you absorb a lot through just reading well-written copy. And you know, academics read other academics, so it's no wonder they write like academics. Lawyers spend years training as, you know, reading, you know, legal articles and papers and things like that. No wonder they write like that. You have to read widely, and the kind of style that you want to. Well, certainly it'll help to affect that voice.
Richard, do your students read widely? You know, I never meet any teenagers. Do they?
I suspect not, if we're honest. You know, they do. I mean, well, once they've, you know, if they do the reading for the courses, and if that's, you know, sort of 3 articles a week, so maybe, you know, between 60 and 90 pages a week, then by the time it's sort of a, you know, 22-week course, by the time they've got to the end of that, and they've really read a lot on that topic, and you know, should really be becoming experts and starting to be confident in their own opinion, which is the point that Justine was making about people not quite knowing what it is that they want to argue. I mean, I guess it is, you know, it is true that people don't read. I'm not saying there was a sort of a golden age where people read, you know, the right amount, but I think a lot of people certainly don't. You know, don't read very much, and I agree that's, you know, a very important thing that people need to do. But I suppose, just to go back to Justine's point, I think we have to remember that it's frustrating when people, having spent a lot of time researching a topic, still don't seem to know what their opinion about it is. But in a way, that's kind of our task as you know, teachers, is to try and help them find out what they do think. You know, we can't tell them what they think, because it has to be their own original thought, but we can, you know, listen to them and say, well, you know, that particular thing that you just said, could you expand upon it or develop it, you know, because it sounds like there's something there. And I think we should probably just admit that it is, you know, people who spend 3 years writing, you know, researching PhDs, it is a thing which very intelligent people do struggle with, to actually determine exactly what it is, to really pin down exactly what their argument is and what is unique about it. So it's kind of frustrating when, you know, we're all kind of quite confident in our own opinions and sort of, you know, feel that in their position we will be able to do it. But I guess that just acknowledging that even extremely intelligent people can find this problematic is important.
But I would say, as a speechwriter, the thing you learn is that a lot of people in politics and at the top of business don't really know what they think either.
Yeah.
That's what they're paying you to do, sort of thing. And it's, you know, the billionaire companies who they're not really saying anything. And they're all going through the motions, and it's, I don't know how you create employee loyalty, or how you know, keep people, give them the vision of what you're supposed to do if none of the language makes sense. You know? That's
kind of an organization. I think, you know, the people I'm talking about as sort of students who, you know, maybe at the start of the career, and as I say, you know, very bright people who having problem working through what they're thinking. I think what you're talking about is that people often in, you know, toxic organizations, people often get to the top by, you know, talking bullshit and bullying people, basically. So the fact that they don't have particularly brilliant ideas when they get to the top is maybe not all that surprising.
Wendy, do you have an opinion about this?
Yeah, I teach a lot of people speech writing skills who are, that isn't their main focus. they're policy analysts, etc. In fact, I talk about, I provide help to the accidental speechwriter. And yes, there is a big difference when people have to shift from just writing, as Gratia said, data and statistics, to actually writing pieces where they have to express opinions and have to persuade people. That's often where you see there's a real weakness. And that, I suppose, is the no understanding of rhetoric. They don't have a sense of how to persuade, or even a sense that they should make an effort to persuade. And sometimes they are afraid of doing it. So that's what I notice. And we recently, I got into a bit of an argument when doing a workshop where I was talking about how you have to set up statistics with narrative. You can't just fling numbers at people. There has to be a framework around them for them to understand it. And I had someone say, oh, I used to work at Statistics Canada, and we were told, make the numbers shine. And that's when I said, I think we're talking about the same thing, because how do you make the numbers shine? Just saying them isn't making them shine at all. So there's that lack of understanding, I guess, about how to handle things so that you're making an impression on people with your communication.
But I think the thing there is you have to have numbers that actually do shine. And I find that people want to whack some statistics in an article or in a speech because they've been told, add statistics. And go back to them and say, but this isn't actually impressive. In fact, you know, we might find this statistic impressive from here, but to an external audience, that is not an impressive statistic. So, and I guess you're right, you either find a slightly different way to say it, or if it really isn't impressive, just leave it out. I mean, yeah.
One text that has helped me a lot understand is Barbara Minto's book, The Pyramid Principle. Is anyone familiar with it? It's terrific. She teaches you the logic behind writing. And she says writing should be making a point summary. That explains all writing as far as she's concerned. She was a big time consultant with, I think it was Kinsey, and I think she lives in the UK. She worked in the UK for many years. So this book it's an old book. I think it might even be from the 60s, but it's still considered a classic in teaching people how to write in a logical way.
Okay, we've got 2 more minutes. Does anybody want to say anything further? Anybody want to add anything? Alan?
I just very briefly. First of all, I wanted to say about, I think Macron was trying to abolish the ENA, which is one of the grandes écoles. I don't know what is the situation with that, because of similar to what happens here, that all the top people come from those particular, especially that grande école in France. That is just a note. And on a corporate side, world, we have even something so simple, and this refers to how appropriate it is what we are saying, relevant to whatever it is the communication we are making. And this is something that I find that many people in the corporate world also, they cannot really, if they don't think carefully about what they want to say and what is the situation. And you find people using the wrong register or things like this that completely loses everyone who is the recipient of that message. And because we have such a very brief time for things, because we are bombarded with things, emails, reading books and whatever, instead of trying to think, okay, this person hasn't got much time, I need to be clear, I want to be entertaining, obviously, if I can, but I need to be succinct. And this is one of the things that personally I find very annoying when people write and they are not, it's not appropriate, basically.
Thank you, Maria. Alan, your final word?
I was just going to share something about to do with academic writing that maybe you've used or interested, I don't know, to those who deal with corporate or civic writing. But there's and I do give this to students, but only graduate students. And not all my colleagues agree with me doing this, but there's an article by a sociologist in the 1970s that is a study of academic writing in the social sciences and what makes a paper or a book successful. The article is called "That's Interesting!" exclamation mark. And he says what succeeds in academia is something that provokes the reaction, "That's interesting," which means it doesn't just tell you everything you already know, because it's boring, nor does it say something so extraordinarily unexpected that you think that's ridiculous. It's just challenging enough to make you go, "That's interesting." And he boils it down. He says there are really only 4 arguments in social sciences. And the first one is something that you think isn't important turns out to be very important, or something you think is important really has no effect at all. That's the first 2. And the other ones are something you think has no structure actually has a deep structure, or something you think has a clear structure is really quite chaotic. And these 4 patterns he then shows quite convincingly appear across all kinds of social science in just the right way to make people go, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that before. So I tell my students, my graduate students, you use that. Find how to say something that will make people go, that's interesting. And it'll usually be, oh, you've left it out this important thing. It's really important. Or it'll be, oh, that thing we thought didn't really mean anything. Oh no, it's got a really clear structure. So that's the secret of academic rhetoric, I think. I don't know how my historian or former social psychology colleagues think about that, but that's how we do it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alan. Well, Arlene, I'm going to look very closely at all this announcement about the RSC report. I did get some communications about it, and you know, I'm glad that you're a strong voice in the RSC movement, and I hope you'll you know, do draw upon us and ask. You know, I'm sure we'll help you demolish this deforest willingly and with lots of vivid examples and powerful arguments. So thank you very much, everybody. I found it a really useful conversation. I hope it will lead to more events and more activities to evangelize for what we stand for. And it's been a very nice afternoon. So thank you very much, and I'll see you all soon. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.